What kind of world do we want to actually create? What is it that we actually want in the future? I think this is an important question that maybe we don't spend enough time on in tech, right? How do we create a society that is, to the greatest extent possible, consensual? Something where we don't lose our freedoms, but that we actually expand our freedoms.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Founders in Arms podcast. I'm Immad and Raj, the co-founder and CEO of Mercury.
And I'm Raj Suri, co-founder of several startups. And today we're welcoming Paul Buchheit. Paul Buchheit is a legend in Silicon Valley. Can I say that? For inventing Gmail, for being an early pioneer at Google. I think you coined "Don't Be Evil," or you were part of that.
Yeah. My effort at alignment.
Exactly. That's right. We want to get into that. Co-founder of FriendFeed, which sold to then Facebook, now Meta, and then a partner at YC for many years. Investor in how many startups?
Over 400.
Over 400. There we go. It's a nice big number. And so we're thrilled to have him here. He's also known as one of the most forward-thinking people, in our networks. And I mean, founders are known for being forward-thinking, but I think Paul's at a different level than anyone. So we're excited to talk to him. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it'd be fun. Somehow we've avoided much AI conversation in the last two. I thought it'd be fun to kind of see what we're all thinking about kind of modern LLMs and AGI and where everything's at. I don't know if you've both seen this kind of graph that's been going around X/Twitter with benchmarks and all of the LLMs kind of converging to a similar level as ChatGPT 4. I guess the question I have is this like a kind of end of the LLM S curve where they'll get better but it'll be incremental, or are we just waiting for OpenAI to train the next huge model and it'll be a step change? What are your thoughts on this, and where do you think we are in this kind of LLM journey?
Well, I'd be surprised if we all of a sudden very quickly reached the end point of this. I mean, I think we're just kind of waiting for the next model. I would be surprised if a year from now we don't have something that's a lot better, just given the amount of resources that's being poured into it. I think part of what we're seeing is that it is just requiring more and more compute to build these models, which is, I don't know, we'll see how that goes in the long term, but I think that's kind of a big part of it, is just the amount of compute that you have to throw at generating the next generation model is enormous.
Isn't there an issue that we've kind of run out of new data to train on? We've already done the internet, we've already done kind of YouTube transcriptions. Is there that much new kind of text-based data?
I mean, I don't think it has to be entirely text-based either, right? Humans train off of a lot more than just text. And I think maybe some part of the limitation of the current LLMs is that we've just been feeding them text. So, if you think about all of the extra data, if you feed in video, other modalities, but I also think there's a lot of just throwing more computation at these things, having them begin to generate their own training data by, exploring a lot of different possible futures, essentially. And we'll see if anything comes out. OpenAI keeps teasing strawberry or whatever. Obviously, I don't know the details of that, but I do think that what we'll see is, in the same way that a human can sit there and think about something for a long time and come up with insights and then, share those insights. I think we're going to see the same thing with AI, right? How long did it take for a human to figure out E equals MC squared, right? That was a very long time. But now, even sort of just your average person can at least imagine that they understand what that means. And, we're all able to internalize that pattern. So I think my perspective on AI is that ultimately intelligence is just kind of pattern finding. And in particular, I actually really like the next token prediction that a lot of people think means it's not intelligent. To me, the next token prediction is almost like a Turing machine. It's something where it sounds like it's too simple to work, but in some sense, it's like the Turing machine of intelligence. If you're able to predict what comes next, that requires that you have a good model of the world. And so what we'll see over time is that obviously right now, I think the models that they are building are relatively shallow, but I think with better algorithms and more computation, we'll start getting deeper models of the world.
So like predictive models, like that can actually anticipate what you're going to ask next and maybe even answer that question as well?
Certainly. I mean, that's already to some extent what happens, right? Like actually one of the earliest versions of AI in some sense is like the "did you mean" feature on Google. I don't know if it basically is having to figure out what your intention was despite whatever messed up thing that you typed in. And part of what's funny about that is that spell corrector was built over 20 years ago now by Noam Shazir, who then later on also invented the transformer.
Wow.
And so he also, basically invented what works in AI. And then just a couple of weeks ago, Google paid close to $3 billion to get him to come back to work at Google.
Wow.
So they did the deal with character.ai.
Right.
Noam left Google a couple of years ago. He called me up. He said he was frustrated because OpenAI was getting to have all the fun of launching things. He invents it and then OpenAI launches it. And so he was eager to ship. And of course, now that Google has rediscovered that it's an AI company, they wisely got him back on board.
Yeah, I saw Sergey is now back at Google. He said he was there. He's there every day now. He's also excited to be part of it, like this AI.
Yeah, exactly. So I think Google now has like a real A team on it. So I think I expect to see a lot more execution out of Google, because if you've got Sergey, you've got Noam, you've got Jeff Dean, are all hard at work on it. Those are some pretty sharp people.
Yeah. And AI models, they don't need to get to the same level or same like step change that GPT-3 was and GPT-4 was. Like even if they're improving 20% that compounds a lot over 5-10 years.
Absolutely.
And I don't think people are people expect the same like revolution every year. It's not going to happen.
It might be. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we do see some kind of step change in terms of ability to reason. I mean, I think that's kind of like the next step. And then I think that also unlocks, like I said, as the model gets better at reasoning, then it can also begin generating more of its own test data, kind of in the same way that, I don't know, we dream or whatever, kind of offline thinking that we do.
If you look at a baby and the way they learn, it is like with continuous kind of feedback loops. Like they try something and they learn, they try. I feel like that feedback loop is missing in kind of this LLMs. Like it's like a massive training set and then there's no feedback. It'll be interesting if someone can crack that algorithm for continuous feedback, because that would make training data like exponential. Like every time it has any conversation with anyone, it's training itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's probably a lot of that, even if you just start digging through like YouTube videos. Right now it's just maybe the words, but if you think about, there's a lot of real world physics, facial expressions, right? Like how good can the AI get at actually just reading your emotions or essentially predicting what happens next, right? In a video, if you can watch a YouTube video and predict what happens next, at some point you necessarily have to develop a pretty sophisticated theory of mind for the humans, and that essentially is intelligence. If you can predict what a human would do, then you can essentially model that human.
Yeah, I do find it funny. Like AI is kind of talking to other AIs. Like there's quite a few like these things where as a consumer they'll act as an agent and call on your behalf, and they're talking to another AI on the other side, and like it just feels like we should have just short circuited all of that and just had APIs talking to each other.
What applications are you most excited about, Paul?
I mean, everything, I guess. I'm kind of working backwards from what is it that we actually want in the future. I think this is an important question that maybe we don't spend enough time on in tech, right? Because we're always just kind of pursuing a graph that goes up and to the right. But I think there is a more fundamental question, like what are we doing? Like, why are we doing all of this, right? Like, why are we automating away our own species? And so, what is it that I would hope for my children, or, hopefully someday grandchildren, something like that? Like, what kind of world do we want to actually create? Boiled it down to is essentially, how do we enable everyone to live their kind of best possible life, right? And, we especially have, I think, access to a lot of great resources in terms of, therapists, coaches, whatever it is, if you want to get in good shape, you want to live healthier, you want to have better habits, or you just need advice. If you need legal advice, we can have access to great lawyers or whatever else. But for the vast majority of people, 99% of people, they don't have that, right? And so a lot of what I think about is just how do we take what it is that only the very fortunate have today, and as best as possible make that universally accessible to everyone. So a very simple example of this is just like if I have a medical concern, I email my doctor or I text my doctor, and someone replies, pretty quickly, right? Like I can get real-time health advice. I have good doctors. Most people don't have access to that, right? Like your kid is sick and then you're on the phone waiting on hold or something like that. And so very near term, I think we can actually get to the point where you kind of give everyone access to, let's say, medical advice that's probably better than the median doctor. Same thing goes for legal advice. There's a Peter Thiel quote from back in the Hulk Hogan case where he says, even single-digit millionaires don't really have access to the legal system, right? Because if you're gonna go into a hardcore legal case, it's gonna cost you millions of dollars. That seems pretty deeply unjust, right? Like, if we actually had really great AI lawyers, how about if everyone has access to really high-quality legal representation? And then, of course, that also feeds into questions around like privacy and so forth. Is my AI lawyer going to rat me out to the cops or whatever? So, ideally, that's kind of like the direction I think of it from is just making things more universally accessible to as many people as possible. The second part is just, what kind of society do we want to build, right? And this ties in as well. For me, my kind of number one concern politically and technologically is around centralization of power. I worry a lot. AI does have this ability to create also a deeply dystopian society where essentially we're all in a cage, right? Because all of these things of like 1984, we can take it to the next level where you're being monitored at all times, and especially as the AI gets better at essentially mind reading, there's a level of censorship and control becomes possible that creates a kind of prison from which escape is impossible. So that's a bad outcome. What I would like to see is the other direction, again, where it comes more down to empowering individuals to be the best person they can be, and how do we create a society that is to the greatest extent possible consensual. Something where we don't lose our freedoms, but that we actually expand our freedoms.
It is hard to imagine how, in a country, not to pick on China, but in a totalitarian kind of regime, how as AI gets better and better, it doesn't just give them more and more control. Like in the 1900s, when there was a bad government, you would eventually get a revolution. It's just hard to see how you get revolutions when you have good enough technology control over a population. But how do we avoid that in the US? Can we get AIs to be small enough that everyone has a personal AI that they're running on their own device, and that way it doesn't centralize things?
Yeah, I do think, to me, this is one of the reasons why open source AI is so important, both in terms of its availability, but as kind of a, sort of canary in the coal mine in terms of freedom, that, and why some of these, regulations that are coming out, I think are very dangerous, because to the extent that you outlaw open source AI and all of the models become increasingly centralized and locked down, then that's moving us towards that world where it is all under central control. And we already saw this happen kind of without even realizing it in social media. I was unaware, even though we had started an early social network. I worked at Facebook. We actually created the like button at FriendFeed. So I'd been watching all that stuff for a while, and I didn't even realize the extent to which they had managed to really lock down and censor things until, after Elon acquired Twitter, and then they start publishing, the so-called Twitter files or whatever, and you start seeing how much is going on behind the scenes, the extent to which the advertisers control media. To me, advertisers control the news. used to sort of be like, oh, that's kind of like maybe just like a conspiracy theory thing. And then it turns out it's actually really true. The extent to which essentially a cartel of advertisers was able to shut things down. And even now, right, Twitter has lost something like 80% of its advertisers because they refuse to play along with that. And then, some of the same things, if you look at like cable news, something close to a half or maybe even a majority of their revenue comes from pharma. And so you can guess that they're not too keen to criticize pharma, right? Because like that's where all their
I don't even know what
from.
the good argument is for why we shouldn't ban all pharma ads. Like the prescription medicine, like doctors should be doing it. Like I just don't get it.
I mean, I think like if you were really going to reform the American healthcare system, that would be an easy win, right? Because all they're doing is taking our money, right? Like we pay 10 times as much for our prescription drugs in the United States versus like anywhere else in the world. And so then they're taking our money and then they're feeding it back into the media and into, the politicians so that they have control over the system so that they can continue jacking up the prices and limiting competition. And so it's just this sort of circular system of control and just unreasonably high prices.
Yeah. Coming back to AI. So I feel like one thing that is somewhat helpful is there is this, if someone makes a breakthrough, it seems like, if Claude makes a breakthrough, then OpenAI and Google and Llama kind of catches up. It seems kind of beneficial to have like lots of people in the horse race.
Absolutely.
Do we think that continues, or like is there a chance like one of these companies can like actually pull ahead for the long term?
I certainly hope it continues. And I mean, this was kind of the plan, even going back to really the founding of OpenAI. Like not a lot of people are aware that OpenAI was kind of a YC spin out. So back in 2015, we were watching the development of AI and it was starting to make really impressive progress, right? Like kind of in the 20 years ago, we didn't really know when AI was going to happen, right? It was still kind of a speculative sci-fi thing. At Google, we had this idea that with enough data and computation, we were going to figure it out eventually, but it was still in the indefinite future. And what started to happen, I think, in the early teens is we would see the deep learning was really starting to deliver impressive results. They were getting good at playing video games, that kind of thing. And so, but at the time, it was almost entirely locked up inside of Google. And so OpenAI was kind of this like crazy plan to bring it out of Google and make it more accessible to the world. At the time, the probability of success seemed extremely low. And there's actually a really funny Elon email that came out of one of the lawsuits between OpenAI and Elon, where he says, like, I estimate you have a 0% chance of success, right, for OpenAI.
Well, that's true for any
so
startup.
The fact
right?
that they've made it as far as
that's true for any startup at the start.
Yeah, I mean, this was actually a couple of years in when he was saying it, but it was kind of a crazy thing to think that a startup could take on Google at something as huge and expensive as AI, where Google had. I mean, they basically invented all this stuff, right? And they have all the data, and they have so many really brilliant researchers. So I think like we're in a much better place than we were 10 years ago when it seemed like it was all going to be locked up inside of Google. Now I think the thing it's clearly on a trajectory where it's going to be really important and really valuable. And so at the very least, you have the big tech companies are going to keep investing mountains of money, right? Like Facebook has no shortage of cash to keep pouring into AI. And they're not dumb. They're not going to stop playing. Same with Microsoft and obviously Google.
So apparently Perplexity is raising at a 3 billion valuation. I do wonder whether, like with AI, you just get the answer. Whereas over time, with Google and more sponsored links, getting the answers become harder, right? Like I often search for something and I'm like, wow, there's like 2 page folds down before I get to like the actual links and get past the ads. I just don't see how like an AI that just answers the question is not going to make less money than a search engine that like makes you kind of jump through a bunch of links. So that does seem like inherently disruptive.
It is. Yeah. Clearly Google's business is going to have to change in the next 10 years. We don't know exactly the timeline. Actually, I've been just observing my own behavior, I still pretty habitually use Google, partially just because it's so deeply wired into my brain. But yeah, I mean, certainly, I think over time, as the AI gets better, and especially I think as it gets integrated, it'll be really interesting to see how Apple does with their Apple Intelligence. That I think that's where it starts to get really interesting is when it's more tightly integrated into your device, and you're not even really thinking in terms of search anymore. You just have a question, and you're able to just ask that. The problem I've had so far with a lot of the AI search tools is that it still has essentially the garbage in, garbage out problem, where the AI essentially does a search and then it's really just summarizing the search results for me, but it still doesn't really answer a question that requires some level of deeper research. But that's inevitable, right?
I have like a mental model of things that AIs can answer and things that I need to go deeper in. And it's like, if there's a question that one of my kids asked me, like my 7-year-old, yes, like ChatGPT will always have an answer. But if there's something that's like, okay, unknowns with like any sort of like research papers I'll have to read or anything like that, like there's just no way you're going to get AI to do it right now.
Yeah. Well, the other problem I find with it sometimes is it essentially is like information laundering. Because at least when I do a search on Google, you see the domain and you naturally bracket the information. Okay, it comes from here, versus like when you do the AI search, it kind of like washes away where it comes from, and you lose that sense of like, okay, this is a reliable source or an unreliable source that you get with Google. So I think it still needs a couple more iterations before the AI search really completely replaces traditional search.
Yeah. And one way to rewire your brain, Paul, is what I think I've tried. On my Arc browser, I changed my default search engine to Perplexity. And the question is, how much do you miss Google, right? And once you move that, and the answer is not much. You actually, Perplexity gets you what you want almost all the time when you're looking something up. That's an experiment worth running for anyone. It's just like just to see. The only reason you end up looking for Google is actually for news. Everything else, like Perplexity does a pretty good job of surfacing it, gives you the answer with less clicks, and generally it's a good answer. Is my view. It's like it's not always perfect, but they also do have some source material and they have footnotes. So it's not that bad. It works pretty well once you change the default, and that's why I think Google was sued, right? For being a monopoly, because they paid.
Google understands the power of defaults. I mean, that's the whole reason that Chrome exists, right? It was the fear of getting squeezed out like that.
And Android.
And Android, yeah, of course. Yeah, all these platforms are really just ways of defending search.
And that's likely to be illegal now. I mean, you're not going to be able to or at least that type of deal, like being, I guess, paying to be a default, is likely to be illegal. So that's why Google.
That's bad news for Mozilla if that happens. What's going to happen to? That's where all of their money comes from. Is Google giving them paying for search?
From Mozilla. Wow, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Bad news for Firefox if that actually gets cut off.
I mean, it's also $20 billion for Apple, right? Which is kind of crazy. I assume there'll be a way to still monetize it. Like maybe you're not the default, but you're the top choice. And but
it makes sense that these platforms have to present a choice. Like they don't present an explicit choice. Maybe when you set up, you have to pick your search engine. By not doing that, you really you do lose choice from.
I mean, that is a worse user experience, though, right? When I install a browser, I just want it to work. I don't want to go.
Yeah, I think the real question is just when it gets good enough that people just switch on their own, right? For me, I remember back in the 90s, before Google, it was Alta Vista. And so I was an Alta Vista user. And then I remember it was kind of like I would search for something on Alta Vista and then it would fail. And then I would go to Google and I got the result. And after like the third time that happened, I just stopped ever going to Alta Vista, because you're just like, why wouldn't I always start at Google? And I think that's kind of like the threshold. Again, for me, it hasn't been passed, but it's going to happen, right? It's not that far out where it just becomes like, why do we even bother going to Google if I always get a better result somewhere else? And then I just modify my behavior.
Yeah, but that was different, right? That was the internet, like Wild West, where everything was changing all the time. And I remember those days. And you're like always trying to find a better website. Now people are just like, it's been so many years now where Google has had that monopoly or had that dominance. So now after
But it's kind of the AI Wild West now, right? Like everyone's trying out AI products.
Yeah, anytime you have a huge platform shift like that, it's kind of all up for grabs.
That is kind of like the startup opportunity. Like you see it in B2B as well. Like people are willing to try products just because they have AI. And I think the willingness for consumers and businesses to try new things is much higher than it was like even a few years ago. I guess this kind of ties to like the last topic we wanted to touch on, whether there will be a resurgence in social apps. I mean, if you look at, I guess, the last even 10 years, there hasn't really been a new social app that's reached a significant scale.
Unless you count TikTok.
TikTok seems like a pretty big one.
TikTok, yes. Okay, TikTok. But even TikTok is like, it's almost, I guess it is social.
Not very social.
But it's like mostly
like
broadcast content rather than like any sort of like follower/friend network. So it is slightly different, but it is a social app. And actually TikTok is an AI app, right? The reason it won is because its like recommendation engine was like unique and different. So it is kind of interesting. Like that is a good example of an AI social app that people don't think of.
I mean, I would still argue that WhatsApp and Instagram both have like become so dominant in the last 10 years, like extremely dominant. And, 10 years ago, they were not at all dominant. Instagram was basic, like a couple of years in, and then, WhatsApp was like a niche app, right? So it's now they're super dominant. So things have changed a lot in 10 years.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, for me, one of the things that's funny about Instagram is, we started Friend Feed in 2007 and then sold it to Facebook in 2009. And at the time, there was kind of this vague sense of like social being kind of like locked down with Facebook and Twitter and stuff. Instagram was started in 2010. So Instagram was started a year after we sold, to Facebook. I think there's always more possibilities in social. I don't know if this is the direction it will go, but I do kind of wonder if AI can be used to help people kind of like get along better online. There is this strange thing where like a lot of times people who in real life, you get along with just fine. And then something about like the social internet kind of doesn't always bring out the best in people, right? There's too much lost. And this kind of goes back again to like, can AI help everyone kind of be their best person? And it might be that there is an opportunity for a social app that just kind of like makes you feel good and helps bring you closer to people, especially as sometimes the world can feel very polarized on a lot of different things. So to the extent that people can understand each other better. But that might just be sort of an idealistic dream and not a practical one.
I think the reason social apps tend to go the opposite way is because that's what gets people addicted. Like conflict and, like having someone to hate and all those things are like fun for people.
People enjoy good feelings too, right? Like people get addicted to, I don't know, heroin or something because it feels good, not because they like the conflict, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So I think if there was really a social app where you're just like, it feels like a real pick-me-up, right? Like you've had a rough day and it's a kind of your happy place. And so I don't know if it's possible, but that would be, I think, maybe a productive direction to look with AI is how do you use this to just make people feel better?
Do you think AI interactions can make people like take the like button, it still feels great when people like your content, like even if you know that that's been happening forever and it's not new. But like if an AI likes your content, do you think it would feel as good, or is it the human behind it that like makes you feel good?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of want to believe it's a human at the very least, right? Because what it comes down to is we're these like intensely social creatures, right? We evolved as part of a tribe, and like we crave that social approval at a really deep evolutionary level, because like if the tribe doesn't approve of you and you kind of get left behind, you die, right? Like I think we have just deeply embedded in us a fear of not having that approval. And so just even getting all those stupid little likes, you're like, oh, I'm accepted by the tribe.
There's also like a proof of work element to it. Like it takes effort for someone to comment or like on things. Whereas like you would think AI can like do it without like actually putting effort in. I guess a little bit of energy.
Yeah, that said, the like character AI is basically all about, kind of having AI friends. And that's a very popular thing as well. In part because it enables people to have more safe conversations, right? Because you're not going to get judged by the AI, so people are able to in some ways be just a lot more honest and explore topics that they would be afraid to discuss with a human because they would fear judgment or some kind of like social disapproval.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a trend towards more private interactions. Whether it's in like group chats, which obviously I'm working on, but also with AIs, people. I think we had this kind of era in our society and humanity where we've enjoyed connecting with everyone, right? It's a very universal experience, connecting with the whole world, right? And then you kind of realize the downsides of that. The problem with connecting with the whole world is the whole world can see what you say, and then you become a different person when you're talking to the whole world. And the whole world is judging you, and you're judging them, and like people become unhappy because of that. But the nature of human society is not a like it's very unusual. It's abnormal for us to talk to the whole world at the same time. It's more normal for us to be in like a village or a tribe and actually just talk to a small group of people, and get to know them really well and build long-term, a sustainable relationship. So I think that's what makes us unhappy is when we have these things that are kind of like very jarring. To like put a tweet out and then you're getting attacked by all these people who don't know you and you don't know them. It's something that hasn't happened before in humanity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's definitely an unusual thing. I mean, I don't think that we're ever really, again, evolved for this kind of thing where suddenly thousands of people hate you or whatever. And I remember having this experience, early on, just with like launching a product or something like that. And it's like, even if most of the feedback is good, like the negative stuff still kind of like stings disproportionately. And you kind of have to get over that with time, but it'd probably be nicer if you didn't have to. I think you're on the right track. People probably behave better and are just happier, kind of in these smaller social groups that are more evolutionarily appropriate.
I do find it funny sometimes how like super benign things get people worked up. Right? I did a post on X/Twitter about like how single player sports like tennis and golf are like more used as adults, but kids only play team sports. And everyone was like, "You're crazy! Like, kids should have fun." And I was like, "Oh my god!" I was like implying they shouldn't ever play sport. And it was just such a funny, like, overreaction to like a small thing. And yeah, it goes to play this point that like, there's people out there that are ready to get angry at you, and it's much easier to talk in small groups.
Paul, I want to ask you a question about some of your pinned tweet is very interesting. About truth and narrative. I thought it was very profound. About how like truth shapes narrative, but narrative also shapes truth. Would love you to expand on that and what kind of impact that insight has on society, and how do we kind of like get over this very human instinct to attach to a narrative? We love storytelling as humans. It's part of like the cave paintings back in tens of thousands of years ago at the very least, right? It's like a big part of who we are. It's our imagination, right? But there's also downsides, as you point out.
Yeah, I'm glad you read it. I can't always tell if anyone actually understands what that one was, but I mean, I think it's more fundamental than we realize, because essentially our entire perception of reality is filtered through these narratives. And so, our sense of like what is reliable information, like what is truth, and obviously the place where this is most visible is like with politics, right? Where people genuinely believe, and you'll see, I don't know how anyone could be so stupid as to vote for the other side or whatever, right? And like, to me, it feels like if you can't really tell a good story for, explaining the other side, why a person would think that that's reasonable, then I don't really think that even your perspective has validity, right? Like if you can't tell both sides of the story, I think like that kind of means you don't really understand, like, right? You're lacking in perspective. And so part of this kind of goes down even to the question of alignment, right? Like when they talk about aligning AI with human values, it's always like, whose human values, right? Like we don't all have the same values. And so I don't have necessarily like a straightforward answer to that, but I think like to the greatest extent possible, if we're able to at least be aware of these narratives and be aware of multiple narratives and how they fit together, then we are less controlled by any one of the narratives. And it's not, it's very easy to go after like politics just because it's very visible, but it's such an incredible part of just our daily life, right? Like, my favorite author is this woman, Byron Katie. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Byron Katie. She has a book called Loving What Is. And I have it I download it off Audible. I recommend the audiobook version because it's in her voice. And I've listened to it just like over and over again. If my brain gets stuck on something, I can just go like listen to it. But her whole thing is essentially about questioning these stories that we tell ourselves about the world. And she has a lot of these things where you kind of identify the narrative that you're stuck on and then turn it around and explore kind of counter narratives. And part of what makes her book really interesting is she actually just works with a lot of people who in many cases have been struggling with something like their whole lives. Like there's one guy, he was a child during World War II in Germany, and like bombs were falling on him. I think like one of his parents got blown up. Like he had a really rough time, and he's just very angry at war. People should not, war should not exist. And she turns it around and kind of explores all of this and comes to this point where she says, in reality, bombs were falling on your head for 2 years, but in your mind, they've been falling on you for 30 years or whatever, right? Like you've been living that war over and over again your whole life. And trapped in that narrative, and that's keeping people from really living their lives, because they're trapped inside of these stories about how the world is or how the world should be. And it's just an incredibly powerful thing, because I'll find myself sometimes where I'm just like unhappy about something dumb usually, but she has, some of these catchphrases that come back, and one that I like the most is like, who would you be without this story? Because like, I remember this one case, I was like in the forest with friends having a really good time, but I was unhappy because I'd forgotten to bring something along or whatever. And the story comes back to this line comes back, who would I be without this story? And it kind of gives you a moment to pause and look around and be like, oh, wow, I would be in just this incredible world of beauty and like wonder, instead of being stuck in my head on some nonsense, right? And so it's everything from like the day to day, just like waking up and living, all the way to, I think, the global systems of how we coordinate with each other and have sense making.
Have you read this book, Beginning of Infinity? It has this idea where, when you think of truth, you think like scientific and experimental things are like the most true thing. And even there, you kind of think truth comes before narrative. But the point that David Deutsch makes in the book, and I love this book, so everyone should read it, is that actually you kind of, to actually come up with new science, you kind of have to have a new narrative. So take general relativity, like the narrative of like mass bending space kind of came before you could actually prove general relativity. So this idea that like actually narrative shapes science was like kind of profound to me, because I'd always thought it would be the other way around.
Well, I mean, it has to be too, right? Because what even counts as science, right? Like throughout history, people have had a lot of different views of science, and we always think, well, that was, people in the past were ignorant, but now we're sophisticated or whatever. But I don't think that's true, right? Like people have believed all kinds of things, if Earth is the center of the universe, obviously is a big one. And whatever you think is true, we have a way of finding evidence to confirm our beliefs, right? Experts agree, whatever. And so to get past those filters is very difficult.
One pretty profound thing that I learned recently, which is related to this idea of narrative, is how narratives also shape interpersonal behavior, and actually help you like build better relationships with like your spouse and like friends and things like that. There was an article in the New York Times recently about like how to get over a tiff with a spouse, and it talked about like, a lot of times we just have these beliefs that build up in our brain about the spouse, and they're not explicitly mentioned, and that's what creates a lot of tension and problems, in a relationship. So when you have a tiff, you have to practice like not only saying what you feel, but also what you believe. And so like which is a totally new insight for me, is like talk about the narrative that's in your brain about your spouse, right? And if you so feeling is one thing, that's just like an output of the belief, right? So but if you have a conflict with someone, talk about your beliefs.
The idea is to say the belief to your spouse.
Yes,
Like say,
yes.
hey, I think you're lazy and that's why I'm mad at you.
It's a good formulation. I mean, I think one way of I've seen it done and also practiced, I guess, is just like the story I'm telling myself is you don't love me because right. And actually, but it's just prefacing things with the story I'm telling myself, because that's just an honest statement of fact. Like the story I'm telling myself is you don't love me because you went off and did this other thing instead of what I wanted or whatever, right?
That also happens with founders. I sometimes find that like they have a story about something and it doesn't match to the reality. Like they have like some vanity metric and they're like very obsessed with, oh, how this is going up. And I'm like, actually, like, that's like a story you're telling yourself that like, no one's actually paying you or whatever it is.
Way to bring this back to founders.
I know. That's what it's about. No, I was just thinking to myself when you said that, it's like, okay, what stories do I tell myself as a founder or about Mercury? And like,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like that's a big part of like the job of like a YC partner or something, is just to like pop those narratives, right? Founders always come in with some kind of story about, okay, this is why, people want my product or whatever. And a lot of times it's just wrong, right? Like one of the pieces of feedback I used to get that was kind of funny is like, you said this thing and at first I was really angry and hated you, but then I realized you were right. Because a lot of times it's like, I don't believe anyone wants this thing that you're making. Go out and get, some LOIs or something like that. Because the easiest thing to do is, you fool yourself. You want to believe your startup is going to be a success. And
well, you kind of have to fool yourself, right?
Like, yeah. Well, I mean, you go off in search of like positive, affirmation. Oh, this person said it was a really good idea. And it's kind of hard to turn around and be like, okay, how do I bring this person to failure as quickly as possible? Because like, that would be like what I think, at the start of a batch, for example, when talking to a founder is like, what is the reason I think their business is going to fail, and how do I get them to failure as quickly as possible so that they can then move past failure?
How often are you wrong? Like you tell people go get LOIs, and actually they do get LOIs. Does that also happen?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's the hopeful thing. But more often when you actually go out there, LOIs have this kind of ridiculous like truth finding thing, because people are naturally encouraging. Like you're working on a thing, so it's like, oh, it's so great that you're doing that. But then I say, okay, get them to sign, a non-binding LOI or whatever. So it's like literally all they have to do is sign a meaningless piece of paper, and it doesn't cost them anything, right? But all of a sudden it's like, well, I don't know, it actually doesn't quite fit in with our priorities or whatever, because most likely what you're solving is like the 11th most important problem or something like that. But no one spends a lot of time working on the 11th most important thing. Right? You really want to find what is it that's making this person's life miserable? What's causing them to lose sleep? Like what's really going to motivate them that they're willing to put their name on, a startup? Like buying from a startup is a little bit crazy because they're probably going to fail or whatever. You as a customer are going to end up stranded or like looking stupid. You have to have some motivation as a customer to want to even spend time talking to a startup.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I have, so I always think about like, is this in the top 3 priorities of my customers? And sometimes I've asked them, what are your top 3 priorities? And then, if it's not in the top 3 priorities, I know I'm going in the wrong direction. I think one thing that founders need to do, and you get better at with experience, is like leave your ego at the door when it comes to like falsifying your own narratives, and realize like it's a big waste of your time to be working on something that like, your customers aren't moving very quickly towards. I think I can see, first-time founders having this problem where they're like, they get attached to a narrative and they get attached to like the things that prove your narrative. But actually, I think experienced founders should attach themselves to things that disprove the narrative and be obsessed with those things. And like, what are all the things, why are people saying no? Why are people returning my calls? Why aren't people asking me for this product? They know I'm working on this. Why aren't they asking me for it? Those are the things they should be thinking about more than the people who are affirming,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think part of it is, schooling kind of gives you the wrong lessons, right? Because in school, you're always trying to get like an A, you're trying to get all the things right. You're not, school doesn't teach you to like seek failure. So, and I used to have this thing I like to tell people, and this is really just a way of like changing your narrative. You can guarantee success by redefining success as learning a valuable lesson, right? And so that way, when you go off and you talk to the customer or whatever, it's not failure because they said that they don't want what you're making. It's success because you learned that they don't want what you're making, right? So sometimes it's just a matter of changing the story to work more to your advantage.
Really fun conversation. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Let's have the books in the show notes so that anyone can read those books. All right, cool. Thanks for coming, and thanks for everyone for listening to the show. You can follow us on Spotify, YouTube, and all the other Apple podcasts, everything. And appreciate you guys listening.